Oh, there you go. Oh, can you hear me? Yes, three. See how like you did this? Yeah. So many reschedules because good old Vermont winter, right? Good old fashioned. I saw so many great snowmen on the way driving over from Middlesex. So it's all good, right? So can everybody see okay? Okay. And there's some folks joining us on Zoom. Great. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks to the library and thanks to everyone in Lincoln for inviting me, and especially thanks to you for being here tonight, either in person or on Zoom, because you care about your community and about your democracy. So I'm Susan Clark. I'm a facilitator. I'm a trainer, and I work with communities across New England on effective public engagement. That's what I like to do. I live in Middlesex, right outside Montpelier, where I serve as town moderator. So I got a big day coming up. Let's see. I'm just going to go through a few slides here. I'm the co-author of a couple of books. One called Slow Democracy, like slow food, but about democracy, ground up, where we tell stories about people using local democracy to make a difference. I also co-authored a book that, and I brought copies if folks are interested, called All Those in Favor. And this is a book with UVM professor Frank Bryan, who is for those who aren't familiar, retired now, but political science professor who's really the acknowledged world expert on town meetings. He spent over 30 years sending students across the state to literally thousands of town meetings and gathering data, counting 4 times during the meeting, what was the attendance, how many men, how many women, which ones spoke, how long did they speak, what was the weather, was there a meal, was there childcare? So he analyzed this data in this classic tome called Real Democracy. It's a doorstopper. It's got all these regression analysis charts and everything. And what we did was create Reader's Digest spreadsheet. This one's like, it's little, it's good for lay people, it fits on the back of the toilet. Very much more looking at how things work. I had to include this one as well. This is technically not a book, but a comic book. But it was so much fun to make. Freedom and Unity, a cartoon guide to Vermont's democracy. And that's made by the Secretary of State's office, and the Humanities Council here in Vermont, and the Center for Cartoon Studies. So, and I brought some sample copies of that if you'd like a copy. So obviously, I'm a democracy nerd. Sorry about that. We are going to be talking about, the organizers asked me to speak about Vermont town meeting. Floor meetings and Australian ballot, and most important sort of options for improvement, no matter what you choose. And I can offer you some history. I can tell you something about what other towns across Vermont are doing, because I've talked with lots and lots of them, and sort of how they're dealing with today's tensions. There is no one right answer to the questions that you're asking yourselves in Lincoln. You are the people who know your community best. So I'm here to offer information, but I'm humbled to be here at a time when you have a decision. So there's a lot to pack in 40 minutes. I will do my best, and then we'll leave time for questions at the end. So what I want to do, this is not progressing. So let's be there for now. Yeah. I'm going to start by just talking about some of the current strains on our society today. Vermont, Vermont has felt enormous pressures in the last decades, just even the last few decades, the decline of farming and forestry industries, shifting values, changing demographics, a huge revamp in school governance. My dad was a 5th generation Vermonter. He died in 1990. And sometimes I just think my head spins when I think about all the changes that he would see if he came back today, just in those decades. in most recent years, of course, we all know the pandemic has completely exhausted us. And if you will recall, at that same time, the peak of the pandemic, the US was still struggling with a huge racial reckoning. And simultaneously climate change, right? Vermont is still recovering from last July's flooding, which climatologists tell us might be the new normal. Meanwhile, at the national level, no matter which party you support, Americans are deeply concerned about polarization that we're experiencing in this moment. And it's not, I'm not talking about just since November, it's been at least a decade. Public engagement is increasingly inflamed by misinformation, social media. There's a great book, High Conflict by Amanda Ripley, and she has this wonderful term, conflict entrepreneurs. It's a useful term. These are partisans, media outlets that make it their business to highlight our differences. They are entrepreneurial about it. They're like, ooh, let's figure out how we are different from each other because they actually benefit from the differences rather than the commonalities. Useful term to remember, useful term to notice when you're listening to the media, and sometimes when I'm listening to myself, right? We all sometimes are conflict entrepreneurs. So these pressures are real, and we need to come together, right? To address them, whether it's just questions of how we're going to deal with the flooding. And the question is, will our democratic skills be up to the challenge? This is a bumper sticker I saw last fall. It's great. It's giant meteor just ended already. So lots of people are pretty sick of democracy right now. And what I just named were some of the external factors. But there's also some internal factors within us as human beings that make it really easy for those conflict entrepreneurs to manipulate us and difficult for human beings to make decisions together. And that's what we're going to be talking about, right? How do we do it? It's hard to do because we are human. There's this wonderful study that was done. It was first done in 2006, but it has been redone many times since then, replicated with the same results. The researchers wired up some voters, to explore exactly what happens inside our brains when we receive new information. So especially if that new information doesn't fit our worldview. So in this case, they had two sets of people who disagreed with each other, Republicans and Democrats in this case, self-described. And they were subjected to unflattering information about their own party's candidates. And they were on one of those brain scans, right? And according to their MRIs, when they were confronted with information that contradicted their biases, their brains actually underprocessed the information. Their prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for conscious reasoning, hardly even fired. And instead, it was the emotional circuits of the brains that lit up. So basically, participants' brains used emotion to ignore information that they did not want to hear, but that they couldn't discount intellectually. And remember, this wasn't a choice. This is a physiological reaction, both the left and the right. And scientists tell us that this idea of us and them, this us-them identity, it's largely innate. It was useful when we were evolving to know whose team was whose. And we are physiologically wired to defend the identities that we have and values. And in many cases, those values are genetic predisposition. All right, so we know we need to take in new information, right? We've got new problems, we need new information. How do we get our brains to take it? The trick, if we want to be able to take in new information, is to frame conversations in a way that doesn't challenge a person's identity, and instead really frame it around what we have in common. And that takes patience, and that takes a certain amount of big-heartedness. This is a great book by Catherine Schulz. She wrote the book Being Wrong, and she has a great TED Talk on this. When we encounter someone we disagree with, we often react on a 3-point scale. All right, so we're talking to somebody, we realize, oh, we don't see eye to eye on this. We actually have a different viewpoint on this. My first thought is, oh, you just need more information. You're ignorant. And all I have to do is kindly share my facts with you. And then we still don't agree. Okay, then we move on to number 2. We move from the ignorance assumption to the idiot assumption. Because you have all the information, but you're just too stupid to see things my way. Right? So what if that turns out not to be true? What if this person that we disagree with has all the information and it turns out they're pretty smart? Then we quickly move on to number 3, the evil assumption, right? You know the truth perfectly well and you are distorting it on purpose because you are wicked. And you'll notice that this latter leaves no room for the most common of human realities in our communities. And that is that intelligent people of goodwill disagree. That happens. Intelligent people of goodwill sometimes disagree. And in fact, the only solution, uncomfortable as it may be, is to sit down and hear each other out. Not always, but often. We're talking about intelligent people of goodwill. And especially our neighbors. And this is especially important to know at this moment in history, because a lot of today's problems, hot topics, things like affordable housing, school consolidation, citing alternative energy, these are not just technical problems to solve. There's technical elements to them, but they are really complex, and they're what analysts call wicked problems. Scientists can't give us just one right answer every time. And partly it's because they're full of polarities. I'm going to use the word polarities tonight. Seeming opposites, 2 things that seem to be the opposite, but they have to coexist over time. So they involve competing identities and competing underlying values that are in tension. So that sounds really hard. But the thing is, the world is full of polarities. 2 crucial contradictory variables that live side by side in your life. And navigating polarities, it's not easy, but each of you does it every day. Anybody here have kids? Yes. Parents, everyone knows parents have to be firm, right? And flexible. Parents must be firm and flexible. 2 like really opposite things. But to be a good parent, you have to be both. A good boss is both absolutely grounded and visionary. Like if you really are going to be a good boss, you have to have both of those qualities. And organizations, in order to survive, they have to embrace both continuity and change, right? We keep the good stuff and we have to change. Continuity and change go hand in hand for success. It's kind of like breathing in and breathing out. Which one do you like better? Our home state of Vermont since 1788 has functioned under the paradoxical motto. Anybody know Vermont's motto? Yes, exactly. Which is the ultimate motto of paradox. If each of us is completely and totally free, we would never be unified. And if we were all in total unity, we could never be free. At least in New Hampshire, they know where they stand, right? Sure, live free or die. So whenever humans, this is a thing that people do, whenever humans feel a tension between 2 things, even when they are 2 good things, we end up pitting them against each other. Because the human brain does not like complexity. We're wired for simple good versus evil narratives. We pick a side, right? So tonight I'm going to suggest that the way that I would talk about town meeting and one of the polarities with it is there are 2 good things in tension here: democratic quantity and democratic quality. We really value quantity. I think we all want more people involved. We want everyone to be welcome. We want everyone to be included. And we also value democratic quality. We want informed participation. We want empowered participation. How do we navigate the tension between 2 good things? So the trick, and we're going to practice it a little tonight, we're going to talk about it. The trick is that rather than thinking that you can solve a polarity, then we solve a problem, like a technical solution, pick an either or. we need to think about managing that. We need to think about understanding the values, exploring the trade-offs, and doing that hard work of figuring out, is there a way we could get both and? Is there a way that we could get a third way? And that's what we'll do tonight. We'll talk about the polarities of time. So before we do, just a quick definition of terms. This is, I apologize because I'm sure this is review for most of you, but it's really important. Town meeting, very different from a town hall meeting. And you just wouldn't believe how many people from out of state think that they've been to a town meeting when they have been to a town hall meeting or a public hearing where voters come to yell and scream or to advise or to sound off or to talk to them. You know this, New England town meeting is extremely unusual because it is direct deliberative democracy. On issues of finance and governance, every registered voter is a legislator. Now, of course, town meeting only has, power over very local issues, our local budget, our town buildings, our roads, our common land, a certain amount of discretionary funding. But we are making binding decisions about spending, making amendments, and otherwise taking direct action in our government. And you can tell you're at a town meeting when government is a we and not a they. It's us. And that's a technical structural fact about town meeting. So what are our options? For starters, we're going to talk about two basic options. There are actually some tweaks in between them. This is the fun part. We can get to that and talk. But basic options, Australian ballot and town meeting. Over on the right, traditional town meeting. It's on the first Tuesday in March or the 3 days preceding it in Vermont. You elect your officers, you vote on budget and public issues from the floor. All that happens from the floor in a pure town meeting. And this is close, but not quite to what Lincoln has now. So how's Lincoln doing? How do you fare? I looked at your numbers. I spoke with your wonderful town clerk. Lincoln has a population of about 1,300 with a voter checklist of about 1,100. And in recent years, your town meeting attendance has averaged between 150 and 200 people. And I know that I know from Frank Bryan's data, people come in and out. He would count meetings. He would count 4 times, and you would see different numbers during the course of the meeting. But and on average, 14 to 18%, and that's definitely above average impact. This is some data from 2019, a sample year that I had a student run some data from Secretary of State's office. It's really hard to get good data, so we picked this one sample year. In Vermont towns of population of under 2,500, which you are, the average highest vote count was 12.55%. That's how many people in an average Vermont town meeting, 1,200 population. So one of the key Frank Bryan findings here, small towns always get better turnout than large towns, both at town meetings and Australian ballot. So yay, small towns, right? And there's some fascinating discussion to be had there about what's that about, right? But anyway, small towns get more than big towns. Even controlling for size, Lincoln's town meeting attendance is 1.5 to 5.5 percentage points above average. You guys do pretty well. Now, over here on the left, Australian ballot, right? Or what the rest of the world just calls ballot. You vote at town hall, or you can request an absentee ballot. Now, Lincoln votes on your town officers by Australian ballot, so you already know what this looks like. In Lincoln, the number of people who cast ballots in March tends to be about double the number who attend town meeting. That's about typical. So 350 to 400 ballots cast, or 32 to 36% voter turnout. So we talked about quantity and quality. Australian ballots got the quantity, twice as many. Come on, way easier, right? Okay, we'll talk about that. So what does that mean? When you the fact that you double your numbers when you vote by ballot is typical across Vermont, but Lincoln's numbers, 32 to 36%, are high. As you can see in 2019, in comparable towns, the average was 20.76%. That's how many people it typically cast a ballot. Now, some of you are thinking, hang on, 32% of people casting a ballot is not high, that is low. 21% of people casting a ballot across Vermont, that's pathetic. And I've heard people say, wait a minute, last time Lincoln voted for president, we had like 90% turnout or something. So what's going on with that? I agree that it's sad. Political scientists tear their hair out about this, but both in Vermont and across the US in general, unless it's a presidential primary year or there's something really controversial going on, turnout for local topics, whether it's town meeting on the floor or by ballot, is always far lower than voting on state or national issues. So just know that and know, compare apples to apples, and keep your expectations realistic when you're thinking about what kind of turnout you might get. Okay, so another little thing about Australian ballot is that if you use Australian ballot for anything besides electing officers, you're required to hold an informational hearing before town meeting day. Lincoln had 2 years of trying this out, right? During COVID, along with the rest of the state. And the numbers from the COVID years, I mean, it was weird, let's just say, right? COVID was weird. And we were all simultaneously starved for community and terrified to be together, right? And so it's hard to say that if those numbers are predictive, but it sounded like in your 2022, your informational hearing peaked at something like 45. There were Zoom attendees, plus there were maybe 20 in the room. Your town clerk said, well, there were more town officials than audience. So sounds like your informational hearing saw maybe a quarter to a third of Lincoln's typical town meeting. And that is actually really quite good for a meeting that is purely informational. We do not officially collect data on informational hearings, but anecdotally, informational hearings are poorly attended. And again, unless there's a big hot topic, in many places they've been voting by Australian ballot on school issues for decades, and that includes my town. It is not uncommon to have zero attendance. Okay, so those are the numbers. Now, this is scary for me. I'm gonna try something with you, and I hope you'll bear with me and call me out if what I say doesn't ring true for you. I'm gonna take a shot at characterizing some of the main arguments about town meeting, and this is based on the town meeting data and also conversations with many Vermont communities. And I'm going to characterize that tension, as we talked about, as democratic quality, democratic quantity. Another way to say that would be democratic depth and democratic breadth. It's another way of thinking of it. So in terms of quality, how deep does the democratic experience go? Are we informed? Are we engaged? And this is certainly an element that people like about town meeting, is that they feel that it is deep. How broad quantity, how broad is our democratic reach? How many people are involved? Is everybody included? Do people feel welcome? Is how we'll talk about quantity. The way that I'm going to do this, this is called a polarity navigation chart, if you want a wonky name for it. It's a tool that was created by Bryan Emerson and Kelly Lewis at Georgetown University. We're going to talk about the benefits and overuses of each of these. And they use this language rather than the pros and cons, because remember, both sides are good. We want both of these things, and it's just that we can over rely on sometimes. So again, tell me if this rings true for you. You can jot notes. You can tell me afterwards what I missed. I'm going to start with the benefits of the healthy use of democratic quality. So this is like a really healthy town meeting system, for example. Citizens have power as legislators, right? They can deliberate, they can amend. We come together, we weigh the pros and cons, we can potentially change each other's mind. At good democratic quality, we can see past stereotypes We have the opportunity to see neighbors as complex people. Sometimes they surprise us. We can build community that way. There's an increased understanding of local issues. We talk to each other. We ask questions. We interrogate and learn. There's two-way communication between the select board and the community. So your two, the executive branch and the legislative branch, you can interrogate each other. It builds trust and more nuanced solutions. It allows local wisdom to emerge. What I mean by this is that, yeah, there's always people who give a speech. There's always somebody who's showing data, but there's also people just telling their stories. Like, this is what happened in my life. This is what happened in my culvert. We've all seen it, that a story from a neighbor can shed a whole new light on things. And then finally, improving democratic skills, improving things like public speaking, group process, understanding how compromise gets made for all the people who attend. So, okay, that sounds great, right? Good. There's a reason we've been doing this for 300 years. What could possibly go wrong? Well, we could over-rely on some of those. So what happens if we over-rely on democratic quality? Well, we just heard that fewer people are involved than with ballot voting. And as we saw in Lincoln, typically twice as many, higher if you mail the ballot. And especially at a time when we hear so much about voter suppression. Oh my gosh, this really resonates with us. Okay, no absentee ballot. So if somebody's sick or their work schedule conflicts, or they're deployed in the military, or they're caring for their kids or their elders, or they're just out of town, they can't vote. There is a risk, if things aren't well facilitated, there's a risk of groupthink, false consensus. People can, if things aren't well facilitated, it definitely takes more time and more effort. Time is precious. In Duxbury, they offer drive-through voting, right? Which is great. You can't do that with a meeting. You can only do that with a ballot. Public speaking can be scary. And I do not say that lightly. According to it was the National Institutes of Mental Health, when they polled and asked, what are you afraid of? What are people most afraid of? 75% of respondents named public speaking as their number one fear, right? So it's super scary. It's scarier than shots. It's scarier than snakes. It is scarier, literally scarier than death. And if you think about it, in a way, public speaking is risking a form of death. Because when we think back to that question of ego and sense of self, we are publicly risking our sense of self in front of other people. We might lose. We might stand up, say a thing, and then lose. And in fact, on a regular basis, in a close vote, half of us do lose, which really is maybe just another way of saying this final point, which is that over-reliance on democratic quality can reinforce feelings of in-group and out-group. When we have that public experience of being in the minority, it can feel like democracy for who? So you can see the attraction of ballots, and you see what's going to happen here. It's going to go, dong, dong, dong. Right? Let's see if we can do that. Yeah. So ballots, these diagonals, they can be a little repetitive, so I'll go through these quickly, but they are important reminders. Democratic quantity, more people participate, as we discussed. This is a benefit. Quick and easy for participants, no public speaking needed. Reduce that risk of people feeling intimidated or excluded. The vote is private. And it allows absentee ballot for those who are out of town. So these are big pluses. And it's why most of our democracy across the United States is done this way. So what happens if we over-rely on this system? Over-rely just on that focus on quantity? Well, we talked about how it eliminates your right to legislate, to deliberate, and amend. And you might think, do people really care about that? I mean, that's just words, right? The data is clear. As soon as you remove power from a meeting, as soon as it becomes an informational meeting, attendance plummets. So in fact, the data shows, yeah, people do care. There is an increased likelihood of multiple revotes. If you think about a town meeting or a school meeting, it's very rare that people leave a town meeting or a school meeting without a budget. They stay until they amend and find something that they can. So you don't have to have these multiple revotes. It does increase the likelihood of uninformed decisions. People vote without necessarily hearing all sides or reading the reports. An argument that neighbors become invisible. When we have a choice of who to hang out with, we tend to gather with people who are like ourselves. That's the way humans are. The power of these meetings is that it brings us together with people who are different from us, with different views. And then these last two sometimes surprise folks. This balance can actually be less inclusive than town meeting. What does that mean? Wait, how could that be? Because we just talked about how you get more people to ballots. Okay, I'm sure some of you are aware ballot box voting across the United States is notoriously skewed to our great shame. Factors like race and income and education levels help predict Americans' likelihood to vote. So what about town meeting? What's town meeting's record for inclusion? So Vermont is among the whitest states in the United States. It goes without saying that our town meetings are also overwhelmingly white. But Vermont is socioeconomically diverse, quite socioeconomically diverse. And Professor Bryan assumed that town meeting would behave like the rest of our political structures and that it would exclude certain classes of people. But try as he might, with 30 years of data, he could find no link between a town's socioeconomic indicators, like people of occupation, their income, their levels of education, and their attendance at town meeting or how many people spoke at town. So this data indicates that there's not a systematic bias and that town meetings are actually more welcoming than America's ballot system. And that's something to ponder. That's something to keep in mind, especially at a moment when, if you think about it, groups like labor unions, the Grange, civic groups like the Elks, these are all in decline. And those used to be the groups where people from all different backgrounds would be perfecting their leadership skills. That's where they would be learning public speaking. That's where they would be learning how to understand an agenda. They would learn to lose a vote and keep your head up afterwards. Things like group process, things like finding consensus. Guess what? White collar folks do this at work all the time, okay? But this is less true for non-white collar people. And so town meeting is often called a school for democracy. That's especially true for folks who don't get those kinds of things. So finally, the last one on here is reducing public trust. And the thing about this, conventional participation is something that it means most of the meetings that we hold in the United States, things like public hearings at state legislature or federal agencies. Classic example would be that public hearing, 2 minutes at the microphone. It would be the informational meeting that we have before Australian ballot. And social scientists have been studying public hearings since the 1960s. And unfortunately, they have a pretty bad track record. Here's some quotes from this public participation textbook. It's a public administration textbook. Conventional participation, when meetings have no power and we're coming in there just to kind of sound off, it ultimately, I mean, they interviewed people before the meeting and after the meeting for over decades. It makes citizens less trusting. It increases polarization. It's also really discouraging for the folks in the front of the room, for the leaders, to be in that situation where they know that they're leading a meeting where the people have no power. And in fact, as the relationship deteriorates between people in the room and the people in the front of the room, people in their institutions, the legitimacy of the financial system of government's decline. And remember, this describes the majority of formal participation opportunities in the United States. This is how most Americans do democracy. They cast a ballot or they go to one of these. How does democracy look right now? How are we looking? Like, we've got a lot of angry people, and there is a lot of arguments why that might be. So this is a lot, right? I'm sorry, this is a lot. And it was a really quick run through, and we could easily spend an hour on each of these quadrants, and I'm sure that you have more that you would add. But stop and think about how you feel. I imagine each of you has some feelings about this. And that is a signature trait of a polarity. That's when I say it's not a problem to solve, it's a polarity to manage. A polarity, what we do is we tend to identify with one pole. Like, either you're a person maybe who really kind of is pretty into democratic quantity and says, no, I really think we should be sticking more with ballots. Or maybe you're one of these people who really loves town meeting and wants to stick with that. If I love town meeting and I really care about it, this is where I want to live. I want to live here. And sometimes when I get angry and I'm talking to somebody who disagrees with me, I'll talk about this. So I'm going to be yelling. I'm going to have the benefits of mine and the overuses of yours. This is what I do. And if you love ballot voting, you're going to talk about the benefits of ballots and overuses. You're going to be green, 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 green. And this is our conversation. Yellow, 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 green, 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 green. Just like totally don't hear each other at all. And that's a polarity conversation. It doesn't get us anywhere. It actually hurts. It hurts. Nobody wants to be described. We tend to put each other in each other's lower boxes, which is not where you want to live. You don't want to be described that way. And when we wind up in those kind of conversations, we tend to pull away from each other because it's painful, and which makes us even more stuck. Right? So for the purposes of this discussion, what I would love to do is can we just agree that we know this stuff? We're painfully aware of the overuses. We know it. And none of us wants them. None of us wants those things at the bottom. We see them, we understand them, we would prefer to avoid them. And in fact, you know what? Let's just gray them out and let's focus on the top. Let's ask the question, how can we get democratic quality while we're also strengthening democratic quantity? What would it look like if we valued citizen power and building community and democracy, and also offered more options to make it easier and less intimidating for people to participate? And that's called third way thinking. It's called both and thinking. So with town meeting, finally get into some answers here. All right, this is so long. I think it's a little bit slow. So remember we talked about, instead of just this either or, how we could expand out the options? We're going to expand it out. And we'll start right here, town meeting with improvements. So here, this is an option. You could keep your town meeting, but experiment with improvements. What kind of improvements? I'm going to go through a bunch of ideas that other Vermont towns are using. So that's one option. Another option is this one here, town meeting, electing officers by ballot. It's a middle hybrid option. And guess what? You guys already do it. So you might not think of yourselves as being in the middle, but in fact, you have already adopted one third way element. You use your floor meeting for budget and public issues to elect officers by Australian ballot. And think about that. Everyone in town has the ability to vote for half of your government. The executive.
Also, I'm sorry, isn't it true also for bond items?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So is that states, local?
But yeah, bond items are by state law are voted on by Australian.
Okay, so that could be in there as well.
Yep.
By ballot and bond item.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Which is, yes, yeah, which you don't get a choice about that, but yes, it's true. And that simultaneously allows you to retain the power of the legislative branch. I mean, with this option, you voters get to actually do that deliberation and amendment and voting at your town meeting. But meanwhile, you do have the ballot option for the other branch of government, for your executive branch, and all of the benefits that come with that quantity. And see how I put these sparkles down here? That's the fun stuff that we're going to talk about in a minute. You can experiment with some of those improvements that I'll be talking about. Now, option 5 is you could pass your articles, move to Australian ballot, but experiment with improvements. So technically, I'm kind of conflating this a little bit. Technically, that option includes 2 decisions, voting on public questions and voting on the budget. Moving either of those to Australian ballot is likely to dramatically decrease your town meeting attendance, but especially budget and money issues. We know that. I put a bright line here, a pink line here, because it's that significant structural shift that we talked about. This is where the power of the people in the town switches from being legislators to being voters who get to vote yes or no. So those are your structural options. Let's talk about the spot. All right, steal these ideas. Tips for strengthening local democracy. These ideas are from across the state. Every town is different. The ones that will be most useful to you will be influenced by the model that you choose. Childcare, number 1. This one we have plenty of data on. You can increase participation measurably, especially among women, because guess what? Women are our childcare providers. So how do you provide childcare? Every town does it differently. Ask parents what works for them. I know you do have childcare. It's possible you could make it more robust, reliable, publicize it better. Ideally, it's free, paid for by the town, or you can get grants for this. Some towns use staff from their after-school program. Some towns use somebody from another town who has their town meeting at a different time. You can use local teenagers. Just don't staff it with moms who are volunteering who should be at town meeting. Okay. Oh my gosh, that happens. Don't do that. Okay. Now another really important one. This is after town size, the single strongest predictor of attendance at town meeting is whether there are hot issues on the morning, right? So if you're looking at a town's data, and town meeting might be sleepy for a few years, and then suddenly, boom, you see this spike in attendance, and it went from 15% to 65%. When you investigate, inevitably, it's because there's something came up. They're citing windmills or something like that, and everybody is using the town meeting to weigh in. The fact is that there's always something interesting on your town meeting morning, but often hide it in the budget. So if your select board maybe increase the amount you're paying the sheriff to address speeding, or you decrease the amount of road salt, you can publicize those things. Here's what's interesting about the budget this year. Or you can put it on front porch forum. Or if you want to be really great, your select board separate it out and make it its own. This is a new model that's coming out. Jericho is using. It's an experiment to have a meeting in January before the select board finalizes its budget to help inform their final decisions. And I'd be glad to talk with you about this. I have to warn you, I think these folks are actually getting out in front of the statute on this, and the way that they're doing it has some risks. So I can't recommend it yet, but there is this working committee, Act 133 working group, making recommendations this fall. And I think that there might be more viable, make this a more viable option. Considering timing, Vermont town meetings by law happen, as we know, the first Tuesday in March or any 3 days preceding. It will depend on the demographics of your community, how many commuters, how far do you travel, and you have to consider school break. Saturday meetings do work in some places. Marshfield even tried Sunday. Some towns discover, though, that people actually really like the weekends as well. So you can also think not just about the day, but the time, keeping it on a weekday, but moving it to the evening, like 4 o'clock or 4:30, and including supper as part of the meeting. If you have supper and childcare, that actually covers a lot. It can bring in a lot. And basically what the research shows is that some towns have seen improvement by changing the time or the date. Other towns didn't help. And in fact, in some towns it made it worse. On average, it didn't make a difference. Which one are you going to be, right? You might be one of the ones where it improves. So experiment. And one thing Lincoln does need to know, though, is that holding town meeting and school meeting together, which I know you do, is very powerful. Both of the bodies benefit from the diverse cross-pollination of the interests. And I know it makes for a long day, but Professor Bryan's research specifically showed that that combination makes for the best attended meetings, and which may be one of the keys to your high turnout. Explain the process. You know, your car comes with an operator's manual, your new stove, right? Why not your town? Bethel has this amazing operator's manual that you can find it online. How does the select board, the planning commission, town meeting, make it transparent? I have some samples of the Middlesex operator's manual that these guys based theirs on in the back of the room. I'm happy to talk with you about that. This next one, super important. I'm a big advocate for towns having a Democracy Matters committee. You know, people on the Conservation Commission love nature. People on the Energy Committee are passionate about conservation. Hey, what about democracy? Why can't it have its own committee? There are a lot of the great ideas I'm sharing tonight actually were generated by the democracy committees in towns across Vermont. And these are groups, rather than promoting a specific outcome, like, you know, vote yes on the town plan, these are groups that support excellent process, which supports the work of all the elected officials. These are groups that can think, you know, beyond town meeting, the other 364 days. They can help change up democratic formats throughout the year. Things like field trips to some of the sites that we're going to be voting on, tabling at events, surveys, facilitating small group discussions. These are all things that can help bring people in, because remember, we talked about something like 60 to 70% of most people don't get involved in town government at all, even if you mail them a ballot. So what are some ways that we can be reaching them in other ways? Good information is crucial no matter what structure you choose. And hey, those materials can be created by your new Democracy Matters committee. There's a Robert's Rules primer. I've got an example of it back there. Some towns put it on every chair at their meetings. They tell people about how to use their rights. Like, for instance, Robert's Rules and state law says that if you want a private vote at a town meeting, paper ballot, just raise your hand and say, I want this to be a paper ballot. And if there's 7 people who want it, you get it. And we need to understand our rights. If people are worried about privacy, hey, it is enshrined in the law. So there are a lot of good resources that are here and available. There are lots of ways to welcome people in. Vermont's population, as you know, is aging. So we have to think about physical accessibility, good for you for having microphones, so that sound systems can meet everybody's needs. We need to be thinking about immigrants, refugees, new Americans, whether we have translation needs. Montpelier East Montpelier created an annual welcome new voter letter, which we copied in our town. So every year we send a letter to people who've just been added to the checklist since the previous town meeting, explaining to them, here's how it works, you know, come on down. And I've got some samples of that back there. Danville does a beautiful civil invocation. That's at the beginning of the All Those in Favor book. We have Danville's civil invocation in here. And a lot of towns have a fresh voter, like somebody who's newly minted 18-year-old, read that at the beginning of the meeting, or in some cases a New American. And it's a really beautiful centering moment. And also, by the way, having young people in the room reminds the grown-ups that they are the adults. Sometimes they need to be reminded of that. Lots of towns use middle schoolers to carry microphones. And, you know, remembering that fear of public speaking that we were talking about, people are more likely to speak if they don't have to walk to the front of the room to speak. So carrying a microphone to them. Look at this, isn't this so great? The grade schoolers in Bethel did a little cheer squad routine. 2, 4, 6. They appreciated the voters. So you've probably seen Peachums, as they make the news every year because they have this partnership with their town and their school where each of the grades goes through this democratic process to nominate a name for a town plaque. And then the voters at town meeting vote they decide, it's like the sixth graders, Sparkles or Fearless Frosty, and which is awesome for the kids, and the parents really like it too. I know that Craftsbury has this democracy committee that's having their students do a sticker contest to publicize town meeting, which I can't wait to see that artwork. And Craftsbury also copied Woodbury to do a mock town meeting with their students. And some of you probably saw this one. This was on Vermont Public. They had the students debate several issues, including how to spend 500 real dollars, real decision, and should they spend it on the new playground equipment or should they spend it on a field trip, right? So if you listen to the Vermont Public show, you can hear the kids sort of like debating the merits of long-term investment versus hands-on learning as the concept for third graders. And in the end, they chose the field trip, in case you're curious. But then the Fairbanks Museum was so honored that they had been chosen. They heard the radio show and they donated the field trip. So then that meant that the kids actually got both, right? So they got the playground equipment. I don't know what the democratic lesson is there. Sometimes you get. Yeah, sometimes you just gotta be cute. You ask for it. It's really great to include food, to include, it's a time to volunteer, honor volunteers and, give awards, coffee breaks, a meal afterwards, whatever it takes. Breaking bread together helps reduce intimidation, and it helps see each other as individuals and as neighbors. A lot of towns are asking, as the folks are at home at Zoom today, can we offer a remote option? And the answer is yes, as long as you offer an in-person meeting, you can have Zoom or public access TV if you have it, and people can watch from home. But people cannot vote from either voice vote or raising hands. And I can tell you, in Middlesex, we did this for 12 years. We did have people vote from home. And then, anyway, I can tell you all about it, but the problem is that, as we talked about, town meeting is a legislature making binding decisions. And so voter ID becomes crucial, way more crucial than it is than if you're just coming to a library. And the Secretary of State has not yet determined a way that they're confident for remote voter identification. Again, I think this is something that the legislature is going to deal with soon. But for now, people can at least watch this. Just a couple more here. People often think that this is soft and not important. Celebrating history, celebrating place. In order for democracy to thrive, people need multiple points of entry. Before anybody is going to go to a community meeting and sit in a hard chair, they need to love the community. So that's why things like your historical society and library programs, Burnham Presents concerts, right? And other traditions that are unique to Lincoln. These are crucial to welcoming people in. So whether it's trail building, the family comes and brings their shovels, or historical society, hearing stories from old timers. This is an antique ballot box from Peacham, actually. Looking at the rocks in your town. Craftsbury is one of several towns. Bethel's another one that created its own free university. During mud season, people can offer skill workshops for free on anything: how to change a tire, how to identify weeds, how to play poker. And we all have wisdom that we can bring and we can learn from each other. And I hope that you have all been hearing about the super creative work of the Civic Standard, which is a group in Hardwick, that they are putting on community plays. They did a Make Town Meeting Great Again after they have town meeting bingo cards. The New Yorker just did a piece on this. So to improve democracy, we have to think way outside of the box, way outside of the simple either or solutions. We have to literally build on what we have in common, our commons. We need good answers, and in the end, I think Vermonters know that there's a public administrator in California who said, people think that democracy is just like it's a vending machine, And if you put your money in here and the services come out there, and if it doesn't work, you kick it. And that's what democracy is. And I think that in Vermont, we know that the metaphor isn't vending machine. It's something else. And I think it might be something like an art. It might be, it's like, it's not very efficient and it's going to be slow. And every time you come back to it, there's going to be something, weeds or bugs or something. But if you work hard at it, it feeds you. And there's something quite rewarding as well. So yeah, there we go. We're done. Town meeting in a big. That was a lot. That was a fire hose. But I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah. I'm sorry I was late. I thought it was fine. Anyway, I was just at a hearing. I'm not going to say where, when, what it was about, but I and many people there walked out the list you had about being disgruntled by the process. That's the way it felt. And I think, the people who were doing the informational meeting didn't necessarily need to set it up that way, of course, I don't. But, so do you have anything in your book about how you can make, say, a hearing better? Because in this case, there were a bunch of men sitting at a table. And it just, the way it all transpired, it just didn't work.
It's heartbreaking because public hearings are actually by law the way that public engagement happens in the United States. There's a reason that it is the most common, the commonly used form. It's because by law, a public hearing, you have to have a public hearing on lots of different things, and including town plans, including so at the local level, but also at the state level, and certainly at the legislative level. And yes, we do have. I have a chapter on public hearings are frequently neither. Is one of the quotes from one of the leaders that we talked with, because it's like you don't get. I mean, the studies show you don't get a good turnout at a public hearing. There's not a lot of public at the hearing, and there's very little hearing happening, and people actually do become more frustrated. So yes, there are ways. Doesn't mean, I mean, right now in law we have to have public hearings, but it doesn't mean that it has to be where all of the good stuff happens. You can have upstream of when the public hearing happens. You can have a public engagement process that includes small group discussions and again, field trips, lots of different ways to take in information from people. What the other thing about public hearings is they often happen really late in the process. Like they do the public hearing and then they vote right afterwards, which is just heartbreaking for anybody who's driven to that. So getting involved meaningfully upstream is something that we somebody.
No, it's my own question. Sorry, I'm keeping an eye for Zoom.
Thank you.
Besides encouraging the development of public speaking skills for youth or other people, have there been any towns who've addressed other ways than having people have to speak in public? For example, submitting written questions or having somebody speak for them if they write it out in advance, if you're publicizing the issues. Is that allowed? Is there a problem since it's a legislative body? Can you have a representative speak on your behalf?
Yeah, at town meeting, there are these funky things in Robert's rules. If you talk to your moderator ahead of time, Robert's rules are made to be broken, by the way. I'm saying this as a town moderator. Robert's rules says no proxy voting. Robert's rules says no written materials. Reading aloud, because it's supposed to be making it so you don't do filibusters. But Robert's rules also says that if as moderator, I get unanimous consent, which means if nobody minds, Barbara is going to read Kathy's letter. Hearing no dissent, Barbara, why don't you read Kathy's letter? That's totally fine. And if somebody says, yeah, I don't want Barbara to read Kathy's letter, then you, and it has to, I think it takes it's 50 to 2/3, but you can just change. You basically change Robert's rules. But also importantly, and this is one of the things that why I said the other 364 days. Town meeting was never intended to be the only time we talk about stuff. It was never, it's a decision-making moment after what should be a year's worth of collecting people's thoughts and feelings and concerns. And you know, by the time an article gets to the warning, it should have been adjusted to be more reflective of the kinds of concerns that people are bringing.
And then is there a good resource for using interpreters, including sign language interpreters or other things? Like, is there a source that other towns are using?
There sure is not that I know of.
Because I'm aware of how the courts do it, but that's not particularly good. And it's definitely not useful in a town hall environment because it's all telephonic and it's really hard even in a small courtroom. And so I know for a fact that it would be minimally useful, if at all.
Great question, and I don't have a good answer.
Okay.
But I would maybe your name because that is you guys know Lincoln is small. That Vermont is full of small towns, and small towns with limited financial resources and also limited volunteer resources. I know that when we even just had, we were just trying to have people participate by Zoom. It took a minimum of 4 to be doing all this kind of stuff, staffing this, making sure the tech didn't crap out, you know, taking the phone call from the person who lost their, you know, signal, and having somebody be an ombudsman who actually would tell the moderator what's going on the Zoom screen. So how much we ask of our communities and how much we, you know, mandate versus facilitate is going to be a judgment call. And it's a lot easier for a place like Burlington than it's going to be for.
Do you know why or how municipalities, including Lincoln, came about to voting by Australian ballot for town officers and the state requiring municipalities to vote for bond items by Australian ballot?
Well, I mean, I don't know Lincoln's particular history, but I know that Australian ballot was something that was initiated in Vermont relatively recently. I don't know the exact year, but it's kind of crept in. I mean, originally it was, and the statute still makes it relatively difficult to, I mean, it's easy to adopt, as you know, Australian ballot, but you do have to vote at a town meeting to do it. You have to look each other in the eye and say, this is the thing that we want. And that's the way the statute was written, I think, because legislators were like, this, you don't take this lightly. This is a significant shift. Interestingly, Massachusetts does not have Australian ballot. So like the New England states all have town meeting. It doesn't exist outside of New England. When America went west, town meeting didn't go with it. It's not that it went and it died. It didn't go. The plain states, it didn't make as much sense. We have these hills and downs and the nooks and crannies in New England that make a more community formed type of government conducive to our needs. But the just plain old town meeting exists in New England, but Massachusetts never adopted Australian ballot. If you live in a town in Massachusetts, your options are town meeting or become a city. They do, or you can do a representative town, and that's what Brattleboro has. And in fact, the other New England states have way more places where you elect people to come to your town. So it's a kind of an in-between. Switzerland, which is the other place besides New England that has town meetings, also does not use Australian ballot for town issues. When I described that to I went and did a study tour, and I was describing, they were just like, hey, yes or no? What kind of conversation is that? You know, they have these elaborate town meetings, but they do use representative town meeting. Zurich, every town in Switzerland runs by a town meeting. Zurich, 350,000 people, they have a town meeting, but it's an elected town. So it's a representative.
In the state, do you have any idea of why they require municipalities on bond items to?
I mean, I wasn't at that, you know, there's probably a legislative history of that, but I think basically a bond is something, it's a commitment over years. So it's basically you're asking an unborn future to take on debt. And so I think for that reason, they decided they wanted more, robust numerical participation. I'm just guessing. Because bond.
I'm Sally Overby. I'm the town clerk.
Yay, Sally.
I'm sorry, I just walked in the door, but I might have some answers to Rob's question. That something that I learned when we just formed our new school district again. We reformed our school district, and when you form a board to begin with, it was a 3-member board, and all voting is from the floor. And then at some point, I can't remember the date now, but on August, we did many elections that one year where we voted from the floor to go from 3 members to 5 members. And then at some point during that, there was a question that said, shall we vote our board officers by Australian ballot? We voted that as well. So we just did that recently. So I imagine for our town meeting and the town officials, at some point in our history, we vote them by Australian ballot.
I guess my question, why are you doing it that way for town officials and not for other business?
We haven't voted to do it that way yet.
Yeah. So it's the benefits and other uses that we talked about. If you put other business, there are 3 ways by statute. There are 3 ways to vote by Australian ballot. One of them is elected officials. One of them is public questions, and one is budget. So those are the 3 things that you have to ask yourselves as a community. And you asked yourselves about one of them, and you're about to ask yourselves about another one.
We have 2 questions from the Zoom. The first is, can you please speak to the pros and cons of being able to have a budget that has been worked on for many months changed with a motion from the floor at town meeting? Thank you.
I love those questions that are really comments. It's all embedded in the question. The select board has been working for months on, usually since the fall, on a carefully crafted budget. And the questioner is saying, oh my gosh, we walked in, we started talking about it, and all of a sudden somebody comes up with some crazy, amendment. The benefit, obviously the downside is, did that really get the full hearing that it needed? The argument would say, how good is the select board at describing what they just did? This is a moment, sometimes when you look at a town meeting, the select board's up front and you think they're running the meeting. But if you had a power, like one of those infrared cameras, and you could see where the power was in the room. The power is in this body, not in the select board. And it's the select board is there telling you about what the executive did. How good are they at explaining why the budget says what it did? How good are they at, how good were they during the course of the year at telling you what went into that budget? It's not an us, them, it's how are we doing this together? And at a town meeting, if your select board can defend its budget, the people in the town will pass it. And if the select board didn't quite get it quite right, this is the chance for the community to make those tweaks, and for the select board to understand, why. When a budget gets voted down, select board or school board often doesn't. They might have an idea of why, and they usually are like, oh, it was too much, but it's like too much money. That's really not a very sophisticated answer. Could you give us some ideas on which things you would like us to spend less on that would make this more powerful? That's the plus.
Is this why you were suggesting that town meeting shouldn't be the only conversation we have, and that they need to be providing a lot of forefront kind of marketing in advance of what the big issues will be, so they can have those conversations without a last minute amendment, like they know it's coming?
Ideally, yes. What you're describing, keep in mind, of course, that our select boards are all, volunteers, or they get paid, a few pennies. And what we asked them to do was to make the budget. We didn't ask them to be a PR firm. So it's a lot, which is one of the reasons I am a big advocate for democracy. help whether it's the select board talking about its budget, or whether it's the town planning commission talking about its town plan that wants you to pass, or the conservation commission that's about to spend some money on a town forest. These are things that they could use help from people who maybe have a little more leisure time than they do, to have some of those conversations, have some of those trips.
Okay, here's our second question from the Zoom. It says, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. Do you know if any towns hold their town meeting in a location outside of town because they wanted a bigger venue, and whether they liked that option?
It is absolutely possible to do that. The size of your venue, I will say that in all of that data that Bryan gathered, people, there's always somebody who asks the question, what if everybody in town did want to come to town meeting? We don't have a building big enough. Bryan's data showed that that's just like, when we think of all the things that make people come to meetings or not come to meetings, the size of the building doesn't even make the top 50 issues. It doesn't keep, it's not why people, it's not an indicator. A big indicator is what's on the warning. Are we asking people meaningful questions? Are we really asking them things that they're interested in? Much more important place to focus our attention. But the answer is there's nothing, you can hold your town meeting wherever you want. So you could certainly hold it at the regional high school if you wanted to. If there was something big that you knew was coming and you really thought, she's, they say, what do they say, that you don't build the church for Easter Sunday. Our town hall is big enough, or the space that we're use is big enough most years, but this year we think we'd like to do it someplace bigger. You can absolutely try to do that. And there's going to be pros and cons, people having to drive farther and that kind of thing. I remember talking to folks in Williston one year when they were considering actually having their town meeting at a mall. because it was the biggest place in town. I don't think they did it, but I do know that there have been places where they've used both the upstairs and the downstairs of a church, and so you can have the sound and the even Zoom piped downstairs. They thought that it was going to be something really big. It's rare though. It's rare. Yeah.
What kind of, maybe you touched on this and I just missed it, but what kind of actual things would the Democracy Committee do to facilitate what you were talking about?
Yeah, well, it really varies from town to town. One of the things that a Democracy Committee often does first is look at sort of the information landscape, like how are we doing in our town? And that's where something like, I have a sample, the Middlesex Operators Manual came out of that, kind of like, there's a lot of stuff that we assume people know that really people don't know. We asked the town clerk, what kind of phone calls are you getting? And the town clerk told us, people, dogs, lots of questions about dogs. And of course, lots of questions about what's the deal with my property taxes, But then how high does my mailbox have to be? Mm-hmm. And where's a good place to go swimming? And, just like, what kind of, what's
when is Lincoln Gap Road open?
Exactly, yes, yeah.
That's
Right, people call the town clerk for everything, right? And that's the kind of thing that you can put into an operator's manual to make people feel like they have a little more welcome. And it can be printed, or it can be something that's just online, obviously cheaper. It can just be an expanded website. So information, certainly. And then I think that a Democracy Committee needs to be responsive to the other committees in town. When I'm thinking of a town forest hearing where the Democracy Committee folks, when people made comments, they typed to them so that everybody could see them on the screen. Or we've also had them, there's a really, really sophisticated Democracy Committee in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where they train people as small group facilitators, so that you can have a more diverse democratic conversation than the kind we have at town meeting at another time throughout the year.
So how would you go about forming that? Is that just comes up from some people that say, hey, let's do this, and then they do it?
Oh, yes, that's exactly it. Yes, you described the process. Yes, I mean, it's different towns have done it differently. Some towns have, it's really great to have your select board, to have your leaders say, this will be great. We would like this. And you can talk about whether you would like it to be something that's appointed and official, or whether it's gonna just kind of be a network. How often does it want to check in with the select board to make sure that everybody's on the right page? Would you like to create a little self-described set of goals or bylaws for yourself so that you know really what the democracy committee is doing? Is it really about town meeting, or is it about democracy throughout the year? Our key focuses. There isn't one. It's not like conservation commissions where it's actually in the statute. It's just something that we are realizing more. I'd be happy to talk with you about what different towns have done.
We have another Zoom question. Do you know how often a town that has moved its budget to Australian ballot later rescinded that decision and voted to go back to floor voting?
So like I said, there are three things. There's electing officers, there's budget, and there's public questions. And the question of how to vote is a public question. So if you have moved your public questions to Australian ballot, then you will be voting on whether to move back by Australian ballot. But if you haven't moved your public questions to Australian ballot, then you'll be voting on that from the floor. So that's one determining factor. And another factor is sort of how good the communication is within the town. I'm thinking of the town of Tinmouth, which did go back and forth several times. And that's a tiny little town, and everybody knew each other. And they were like, this isn't working. And then they're like, this doesn't work either. And it was like more like a family, really. In fact, actually, literally is a family. So that you can have there, it's a what's called the political science, I call it unitary democracy versus adversary democracy. And a unitary democracy is like a family where you're like, where should we go to dinner? It's like, well, you like vegetarian, but you like Chinese, and well, when we'll figure it out. Nobody's going to vote. Especially if this person really is vegetarian, you're not going to. So it's kind of like that with it is harder, way harder if you have if you switched your public questions to go back. But it has happened. Shoreham did it. It's rare. But budget, less so. But what budget, like the money issues, I think I said this, the money issues, Bryan was quite clear on this. When you switch money away from the meeting, there's very little left of it. There's very little left of it. People, it's like, we've got better stuff to do. I mean, I would like to think that we would all come, but we have other things to do, and the meaning and the power. Ask where the power is, and that's how you can bring people to a place.
Isn't that kind of a sad statement, though? I mean, people don't want to become engaged then, and unless they can vote on it the way they want to do it. And I just have a really hard time understanding why you would want to phase people out of the democratic process instead of trying and juice things up so that everybody in town is thinking, hey, have you heard about this or that? I mean, I just don't understand that, I guess.
I mean, I'm with you. I told you I'm a democracy nerd. And I think that it is one of the, it's a really important way that we can be human together. One of the questions that Bryan asked at the beginning of this book, I remember he submitted the first chapter to me for review. We kind of traded up on which chapters he wrote the first one, and started crying. I mean, he talks about how can we live in peace? How can we live in peace? That's what we're talking about. Because we are different and human brains are deeply flawed. We know this. We are just, it's a miracle that we're still here. You know? And sometimes I wonder, you know, what's going to happen tomorrow. So there are lots of different reasons why. I mean, again, I really do believe that democratic quantity and democratic quality are both goods. They are competing good things. And if you, again, ever raised a kid and one parent is firm and one parent is flexible, it's like, you really got to talk about that, because you can't be good cop, bad cop. You really have to talk about what is the right balance in each. It's like this sleepover tonight. Are we going to be firm or are we going to be flexible? Because you definitely don't do sleepovers on a Thursday. But I don't know, it's her birthday, da, da, blah, blah. You know, firm, flexible. And I think it's the same with democratic quantity and quality.
Thank you.
I'm just going to ask one last quick question. Thank you, and I appreciate everyone being here. You know, what I'm interested in thinking about is, like you said, that third middle way,
Yeah.
and especially as someone who leans towards keeping town meeting, I do think it's very real that like humans are incredibly stressed, and that how can if I am and some of us are leaning towards keeping town meeting, how do we really engage our neighbors who are saying it's not working for me, right? And to say like, we do have a really powerful community, and so we have childcare, and other people, but is there a way to make that more robust? Like, how many parents don't go because it's stressful for the kids to head out at 6 o'clock on a Monday? And so I wonder if you have ideas, or actually anyone in the room, to say, like you said, how do we juice up the things that exist right now, not just for myself and people who agree with me, but like how do we reach across in the next couple of weeks to really hear about the juicing up potentials? Because I think if a community can do it, we could. So we can do it ourselves at some point, but I wonder if you have specific ideas besides what you talked about. I think of food, I think of, we have childcare, but what do you do different? And what else have you found or seen in other communities?
Issues and what is going to be talked about at this meeting. That is absolutely the most measurable one. Making sure that people know that a decision is going to be made about something that has to do with us, not us versus them, but how are we going to deal with, you know, whatever it is, the flood, the next thing, which is one of the things that's most beautiful to me about local democracy is it's much less easily polarized by ideology. You know, and we are so easily polarized by ideology, in particular at this moment in American history. And so the less that we can be talking about sort of our identities, and the more about what are the things that we can do together in common to make all of our lives better, the better. So identifying those issues, I mean, it may be when towns do their town plan, one of the best ways to do it is to do a visioning session, something kind of like there's the Heart and Soul process that's done by the Horton Family Foundation, but there's also the what's it called, the community visits that the Vermont Community Foundation does, but there's also just plain old hire a facilitator and do a visioning session. And those, the best way to do those is to have them be as diverse as they can be, so that, you know, maybe you're just going to the town garage and doing some interviews. Maybe you are having the third graders interview the elders in town and asking them about what they love most about community, what has changed most about the community, what do they hope for in the future of the community. The most creative ways that you can think of over time to involve the folks who may be feeling that things have changed so much that they don't even want to come to the meeting anymore. It's not going to be one short quick fix. It's not probably going to be able to completely finish it in the next 3 weeks. But I worked with Craftsbury last year on this, and they ended up creating a committee that has continued, and again involving youth, involving people from different parts of the community specifically, they were able to double their town meeting attendance. So it'll be interesting to see, how there's always going to be ebbs and flows. But conversations, communication, it's hard. It's really hard. It's really hard. Stick with it. Perseverance.
Kind of got me thinking, you've been a moderator for a long time. Have you ever had a meeting where everyone who showed up couldn't fit in the room, and what did you do about it? Because that could happen. We have, I think our capacity at Borough is 200-ish. Is that, anybody want to overrule me on that? And last year we had about 180, and we didn't have this topic on the agenda. There's another one where I'm asking for a raise, and that brings some people out. So I think we have some big things on our agenda this year. I'm expecting a very big turnout. Any ideas of what would happen if that happened?
So do you have a bigger place?
No, it's not in town. I think the school.
The
can have more than
LCS.
us.
LCS's community room we could easily an auditorium, well, about probably how many, but we could also, in theory, I mean, you could open it up and have, depending on how good our audio system is too, and how nice the weather is. I mean, you have options. It's really just everybody has to be able to hear and everybody has to be able to participate.
So I guess we would potentially adjourn to a date and time certain if we couldn't get enough people, and we could have a motion to say there's 500 people standing outside the door and they can't get in, and we can't really run this meeting without letting people in, so we could.
Can we empty out the fire station of the fire trucks and use that? Is that bigger or is that smaller? Smaller? I'm just thinking of the biggest buildings we have in town, so.
Is it upstairs and downstairs 200?
No, it's upstairs 200.
Because you mentioned that some places do upstairs and downstairs.
Yeah, it's hard. It's a little.
So we could
Although if
maybe
you
do
did this,
that.
it's, I mean, I'm imagining somebody might, if it's paper ballot. If somebody went for paper ballot,
Oh,
then
paper ballot, that's how you would vote, upstairs, downstairs.
it would
Take
be
forever.
one way to do it. It would take forever, absolutely, yes. I mean, not all of that. Yeah. I think that would be, I mean, I know that it's a complete nightmare for you. It's also a good problem to have.
Yeah.
It would be wonderful to have that. And I don't know where is it Mount Abe or where your
Yeah.
regional high school is? Yeah, okay. And whether people would just be like, bah, who wants to go there? But that's a bigger.
Tori says 200 people for LCS, multipurpose room, so same, yep.
And I'm not sure who's enforcing those laws.
All the fire department people that are here.
So, yeah, that's not, I mean, yes, so you mentioned that I'm town moderator. We used to have our town meeting at our town hall, which has made the news for being so incredibly inaccessible. And years ago, we switched to our school, which is way more accessible and way more room and just way less cozy. But I definitely have moderated meetings where people were, there were chairs here and then everybody was just cheek to jowl, standing up. So, that happens for sure. But you want it to be accessible. You want people to be able to hear each other and see each other and not, be
Very uncomfortable.
yeah,
And safe.
Yeah. It's certainly something to think ahead of.
Can you say any more about the Jericho model?
Yeah, fascinating story there. This is very much in flux right now. It's very fluid, what's going on in Vermont. And I mentioned that there's this Act 133 working group that I'm actually on from the League of Cities and Towns. It's run by the Secretary of State's office, and I think it is going to be making recommendations in the next year. And I think that we'll be addressing this question. So the town of Duxbury was faced with this question of whether to go to Australian ballot or not for everything. And what they decided was we want to have a face-to-face town meeting in January and pinky promise that the select board will do what we say. Here's how you should change your budget, things like that. And the select board, you know, so far has agreed to make the changes that were suggested at that. And then they vote by Australian ballot in March. So that's a system that they use in Duxbury. It's not supported by law. So if that, I mean, meaning that it's absolutely legal what they do, but there's no commitment. The select board is, like I said, a pinky promise. So if a new select board came in that said, we don't really care about what you said at your January meeting, it just becomes an information meeting. So that is something that worries me. New Hampshire has a system called SB2, Senate Bill 2 is how they created it, and they stuck with the name, where they have a binding town meeting in, I think it's in January. So people get together, they do what I was just describing, but it's binding, so they can amend, and then everybody votes on that rejiggered warning and budget by ballot. And that is what Jericho is trying to do. Jericho and I went to their January meeting, they went through the whole budget, they made some amendments, and the way they did it was at the end of that meeting, the select board said, okay, thank you for the amendments. All those in favor of accepting all the amendments that were just made, say aye, boom, unanimous. And that is what they're going to be voting on in March.
Well, that moves their timeline way up
Yeah.
to be ready in January.
Yeah, yeah. If you go to the Jericho website, it's like, wow. They were pedaling really, really fast. But they did it, and again, my concern about that is that it is a pinky promise that the select board will, you know. So this meeting that feels and looks like an empowered town meeting is actually a bunch of people getting together, you know. But
Which isn't a bad thing.
it's got, again, you know, pluses, you know, yeah. It's the whole idea. My question is, over time, will people continue to come to a meeting? That, I mean, what we know about informational meetings is that they tend not to be well attended. But Jericho, really, they were like, we're going to publicize the heck out of this, and we're going to put it on Front Porch Forum. There's going to be a meal, and we're going to have childcare, and they even had a meeting in October. So they kind of had, it's a 3-part meeting, where in October, it's like, how do you get things on the warning? How do you get, you know, it was even a bigger involvement push so that people could understand this stuff. So I think it's very exciting model, but it's not what they voted for. What they said that's what they wanted at their town meeting. That's what they voted for. It's not allowed, and so it's all just kind of like, it's what we said we do, and so we're going to do it until somebody changes their mind. So I'm hoping maybe we can refine that a little bit better. Yeah.
Does Jericho have the school meeting with the town meeting, or is it separate?
Pretty sure.
I mean,
that it's separate.
I asked that because you said, you know, more people will come out for them. In the case of the school meeting coming in January, though, school directors do not get information from the state, enough information from the state to build a period.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
sad.
Lincoln's system is it's beautiful in my opinion, and it's vanishingly rare as well because of Act 46, which merged so much of our governance. You can imagine how I feel about that, given what we know about scale and what we know about the most significant determining factor of how many people are going to participate in a democracy is the scale of the body. And so small towns get better participation than large towns. And guess what happens if you make it into a 5-town or 10-town district?
So does Jericho?
We only talked about town and not school, but I'm pretty sure, well, they definitely didn't talk about school issues at the meeting in January. So I think not. I think it's a separate thing. I think we straighten it out. This was a lot of walking democracy talk. Wow. I am impressed with your stamina.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can talk about this all night, but my husband can't, so.
Owl. Oh, it's not mine. It's her.
Have a link to the presentation. Yeah, I think that